strikes on the fleet of Russian occupiers, the real situation in Kostiantynivka, and new capabilities of Ukrainian drones. You watching the war now? This is Freedom on Air. I'm Oleg Borisov. Hello? And we'll start our review with the situation in temporarily occupied Crimea. Previously, Ukraine carried out massive strikes on the military infrastructure of temporarily occupied Crimea, significantly disrupting the occupiers' logistics. But now the geography of the strikes is expanding. In 6 days, unmanned systems forces struck 76 vessels of the Russian Federation's Shadow Fleet. More than 70 successful hits have been recorded. In addition, on the night of July 11th, Ukrainian forces attacked 53 military targets in annexed Crimea and in the south of the occupied Ukrainian territories, including fleet and energy infrastructure. These results once again highlight that Crimea is under Ukrainian air control, and all military facilities on the temporarily occupied peninsula are in the crosshairs of Ukrainian drones. Next, let's talk about the situation in Kostiantynivka. The line of contact remains unchanged, despite statements made personally by dictator Putin. The defense of Kostiantynivka continues, even though the Russian occupiers are trying to push along the entire front line and all along the line of contact from every direction. It's worth noting that they are using tactics of attempting to break through on the flanks and attacking head-on, but as a result, they are suffering massive losses. On average, 40 to 50 Russian occupiers are eliminated here every day. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, fighting is taking place in the areas of the settlements of Kostiantynivka, Ilinivka, Ivanopilya, Stepanivka, and Oleksandr Shuhino. Next, let's discuss the situation in the Sloviansk direction, since here too the Russian occupiers are trying to push forward in order to capture the city of Sloviansk itself. The Ukrainian armed forces are stopping dozens of Russian assaults every day. Here, the occupiers are trying to create a foothold for an offensive on Sloviansk and Kramatorsk on the entire agglomeration, but without success. This was reported by Viktor Tryhobov, head of the communications department of the Joint Forces Group. According to the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, fighting has taken place in the areas of Kryva Luka, Zakitne, Reznikivka, and the Alexandrovka district. And we'll discuss this topic in more detail with our guest in the studio. I'm pleased to welcome Dmitros Nigryov, military and political analyst. Hello, thank you for coming.
Hello, thanks for the invitation.
Well, it's not for nothing that the commander of the Unmanned Systems Forces, Robert Brovden, is already being called the Pirate of the Sea of Azov, since the Unmanned Systems Forces have struck more than 70 vessels in just 6 days, and that number keeps growing. The Sea of Azov is under the control of Ukraine's defense forces, the Unmanned Systems Forces. And this is clearly a direct hit, if you'll pardon the expression, right in the face of the Russian occupiers, specifically targeting their logistics and oil transportation.
And not just oil, mind you. The Sea of Azov and its ports, primarily Azov and Taganrog, which, by the way, have been struck, handle up to 25% of Russia's grain transshipment. This is a very serious blow to the economic position of the Russian Federation. And keep in mind, of the 25% of grain exported from the Azov ports, most of it was taken from the occupied territories of Ukraine. In other words, Ukraine's defense forces have effectively put a stop to the looting of Ukraine's national resources, preventing the Russian occupiers from profiting off agricultural products from the occupied territories of Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk, and Donetsk regions. In addition, the Azov ports are used to transship coal and metal products that have been illegally stolen from Ukraine from the occupied territories of Luhansk and Donetsk regions. And this is already a much more serious blow to the position of the Russian Federation as the main supplier of coal to Turkey and a number of African countries. And this seriously undermines the position of the Russian Federation as, well, a partner that can provide long-term supplies. And most importantly, the blockade of the Sea of Azov, and it really is a blockade, has led to a complete transportation collapse in Crimea. Previously, the occupiers tried to use the Sea of Azov to transport petroleum products by barge to support both civilian and military logistics. But now, this situation is completely under the control of Ukraine's defense forces. Moreover, I'll share data from Russian public sources about the successful actions of Ukraine's defense forces. According to reports from Russian media, The number of recorded vessels in the Sea of Azov was 90 on July 30th, increasing to 98 the next day. And then they report on July 6th, the Ukrainian Armed Forces unmanned systems launched an operation targeting tankers in the Sea of Azov. By July 8th, there was already a line of 28 vessels waiting. And let me remind you, before that, there were 98. And now they're reporting that as of July 11th, only 3 vessels can be seen, 3 out of 98. In other words, we're talking about complete and total control of the Sea of Azov by Ukraine's defense forces, making both civilian and military logistics impossible. And this seriously undermines the capabilities of the Russian Federation during the active phase of combat operations in Donetsk region and especially in Zaporizhia and Kherson. In other words, Crimea has effectively lost its strategic significance as a military base for the Russian Federation. And notice, dear viewers, another very telling point. Against the backdrop of comprehensive drone attacks on Russian Federation oil tankers in Crimea, the crisis is not just about fuel. It turns out that Russia's largest bank, VTB, has imposed restrictions on cash withdrawals. Now, you can withdraw no more than $50,000 per month, and these limits have been reduced tenfold. And they explain this by saying that cash couriers can't deliver cash due to the complete blockade of the peninsula. In other words, the peninsula has really turned into a fully blockaded island. There is a lack of petroleum products, lack of electricity, water supply issues, and now a severe financial crisis as well.
And this also affects the salaries of the Russian occupiers who are based in Sevastopol, among others.
This creates social tension in those territories. And notice the line to leave Crimea via the Kerch Bridge is about 2,800 cars per day. In the last day, it reached more than 3,500. And this is evidence that Crimea is gradually being cleared of the Russian presence, including those so-called newcomers.
It's no coincidence that people say the Kerch Bridge isn't being destroyed just to give the occupiers a chance to leave faster.
Yes.
About an important point. For the first time, Ukraine struck the Omsk oil refinery, which is 2,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. What's important is that the Wall Street Journal writes that Ukrainian drones are now reaching as far as Siberia, the city of Omsk. Here are photos confirming the attacks. And Russia doesn't have enough air defense systems to protect all important sites. Honestly, if I had read this news back in 2022, I wouldn't have believed it myself. Such a turn of events, where drones successfully fly over Russian territory for 2,500 kilometers and attack an oil refinery, we can see it burning. This was definitely part of the so-called special military operation plans when they wanted and started this war against Ukraine.
And by the way, notice that one of the strategic goals of the so-called special military operation was demilitarization. You remember the loud statements made by the Russian dictator? And what do we have in the end? We have the 5th year of the war, and Ukrainian drones are flying across the entire territory of the Russian Federation for 2,500 kilometers without being intercepted by Russian air defense. It's gotten to the point where today, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan officially denied statements by several Russian experts claiming that Ukrainian drones allegedly attacked Omsk from Kazakh territory. The Russians have nothing left but to resort to blatant slander. After all, they have to somehow explain to Russian viewers why their air defense isn't working. It's easier to blame Kazakhstan. Supposedly, if the drones came from Kazakh territory, the distance would be much shorter, which supposedly makes it easier to explain.
It's just an excuse.
An absolute excuse. And the Russian side isn't even bothered by the fact that they are critically dependent on Kazakhstan for gasoline supplies right now. But regarding Omsk, this is evidence that in the 5th year of the war, the Ukrainian defense industry has not only managed to scale up, but also to improve the tactical and technical characteristics of its strike systems. You remember, Oleg, just about 6 months ago, we were talking with you about the absolutely fantastic results achieved by Ukraine's defense forces, the drone forces, when we commented on the strikes against the Ufa plant, which is 1,700 kilometers away. Then, a month later, we reported that thanks to improvements in the tactical and technical characteristics of fluorine monophosphide 1 and fluorine monophosphide 2, strikes were carried out on two men, which is 2,000 kilometers away. And it turns out that wasn't the final result. Now, we're already commenting on a distance of 2,500 kilometers. And what's especially noteworthy, Omsk is the largest oil refinery in the Russian Federation. The annual oil throughput is 22 million tons. And after a major modernization, oil processing is now at 100%. There were massive investments made specifically to modernize this facility. And just today, I checked Russian social media pages. It turns out the Omsk oil refinery has stopped production, which means there's now a shortage of petroleum products. And the Omsk oil refinery accounted for almost 10% of oil processing in the Russian Federation. This is a profound economic crisis. And most importantly, it's not just in Russia. Keep in mind, through the Omsk refinery, the Russian Federation supplied petroleum products to places like Mongolia. And it escalated into an international scandal when a member of the Mongolian Hurl came out and accused the Russian Federation of Nazism, saying that they were not fulfilling their contractual obligations regarding the supply of petroleum products to their country, thereby provoking an energy crisis in Mongolia. But the most remarkable thing is that after the shutdown of the oil refineries, all the focus is only on the fuel component. But the main thing is, the production of ammonium nitrate has dropped. And that's not just for agricultural producers. First and foremost, these are dual use goods. They're for the military industrial complex. And Russian military public pages are horrified to report that in May, the drop in ammonium nitrate production, which means it's impossible to produce gunpowder and explosives, fell by 14% compared to the same period last year. There you have it. This is the comprehensive impact of Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries in the Russian Federation. To sum up, there is a crisis in the Russian Federation, a fuel crisis in the countries with which the Russian Federation has signed long-term contracts, and accordingly, a blow to the Russian Federation's military-industrial complex.
After all, besides being strikes on Russia's economy, hits to the Russian budget and attacks on oil refineries, which also need to be repaired, costing money, there's also a psychological factor. Russians are starting to feel the war themselves, aren't they?
Yes, 2,500 kilometers. Just imagine.
And places where the war is only mentioned somewhere on labels or leaflets about the so-called heroes of the special military operation.
At best, the war was just something on TV, and only in the bold statements about yet another so-called Stalingrad by the Russian army. And now, for 2,500 kilometers, you hear the sounds of air raid sirens. This, accordingly, is a shift in consciousness in the minds of Russians. They realize that the war has already reached beyond the Urals, something that has never happened before in Russian history. And the question arises, what is the point of the special military operation if air raid sirens are already sounding in such strategic rear areas of the Russian army? This, accordingly, is already an element of distrust toward the actions of the central authorities. In other words, the creation of those very social tensions in the Russian Federation that can and should stop this war.
Could this influence Putin or Putin's inner circle, the so-called Kremlin towers, when it comes to ending the war against Ukraine?
And they understand this perfectly well. Right now, Russian media are spreading the idea that the Ukrainian side is working on a so-called Q effect scenario. That is, creating social tension in the Russian Federation that would force the authorities either to end the war or, accordingly, to change the very nature of the political elite in the Russian Federation. Let me remind viewers what this specific term means. In 1917, a shortage of bread in St. Petersburg led to the collapse of the Russian Empire. This, in turn, resulted in the so-called February Revolution and, accordingly, the October coup. Similarly, the Q effect led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Putin is in a panic over what's happening now. And now there's already a gasoline shortage of up to 30%. They can't fill the domestic market. despite imports from Belarus, where oil purchases have hit a record high of up to 140,000 tons. For comparison, until May 2025, shipments from Belarus were just 1,000 tons. 1,000 tons? Can you imagine how much that has increased? Purchases from Kazakhstan, selling oil to India for next to nothing, and in return, buying gasoline from there at critical world prices. And even all of this can't meet the demand. And all of this leads to social tension, which the Russian dictator and the so called Kremlin towers are so desperately afraid of.
Just a week ago, we discussed the situation in Kostiantynivka when Putin, dressed in military uniform, pompously announced the supposed capture of this city. A week has passed, actually more than a week, and the front line hasn't changed. President Zelensky says that they managed to stop this major offensive and are inflicting massive strikes and losses on the Russian occupiers. And now, the Russian occupiers have started to attack the capital, Kyiv, more and more often, prioritizing it with expensive ballistic missiles. But this isn't of strategic importance for Russia, considering they're using S-400 missiles, which aren't highly accurate. Their deviation from the target can be hundreds of meters. This is clearly because of their failures at the front. Well, even those so-called Z military bloggers could see that.
Yeah, and in fact, the Z military bloggers point out that they don't control Kostiantynivka. Kostiantynivka is a complete gray zone. Moreover, as you rightly noted, over the past few weeks, Ukraine's defense forces have managed to stabilize the situation to a significant extent. At the moment, fighting is taking place, yes, in the urban area, specifically on Soborna Street. The occupiers are trying to break through the defense forces' positions in several directions. First and foremost, this is Ingorhora neighborhood, the so-called Shanghai, and from the west, they're trying to gain a foothold near the multi-profile hospital in school number 1. But the main point is this: all of Putin's statements about full control over Kostiantynivka, let me emphasize again, are refuted even by representatives of the Russian army. They highlight the failure of assaults on this city. And against this backdrop, there has been an increase in attacks using ballistic missiles specifically against the Ukrainian capital. Why? To exert an element of military political pressure on Ukraine, especially given that our strategic partners have not fulfilled their commitments to supply Ukraine with anti-ballistic systems. In other words, they're trying to use this window of opportunity to force the Ukrainian president to sit down at the negotiating table, but on Russian terms. And notice the ballistic strikes are exclusively targeting residential infrastructure in Ukrainian cities. Unfortunately, this doesn't only affect Kyiv. Today's strikes on Zaporizhia, Dnipro, and Kharkiv are once again the use of ballistic missiles, those same S-300 and S-400 systems that have been modified for ground targets, plus the use of guided aerial bombs, KABs. And first and foremost, it's residential infrastructure that's being hit, resulting in numerous civilian casualties. In other words, it's an attempt to create social tension in the territories controlled by Ukraine's defense forces in order to A, put psychological pressure on the military and political leadership of our country.
A ballistic response against the Russian Federation, would that be considered parity when it comes to carrying out such strikes?
Yes. But at the moment, the Ukrainian side is leading in terms of both the timing and the quality of strikes on Russian territory using fixed-wing UAVs. We are able to launch more than 400 units in a single night. In addition, comprehensive attacks have begun on Russian territory using both UAVs and, accordingly, FP-5 cruise missiles. And that's exactly what the Russian occupiers are afraid of. And accordingly, we are also waiting for the tests of Ukrainian ballistic missiles. The Russian side has already claimed that a Ukrainian ballistic missile was shot down over Moscow. Apparently, this refers to the practical testing of Ukrainian ballistic missiles. And it's no coincidence that Moscow and the Moscow region were chosen as the targets for the first test flights.
Dmitry, thank you so much for your analysis. Dmitry Snigarev, military and political analyst, was here with us in this studio. Well, let me remind you that you can find all the information about the situation at the front and more on our Freedom YouTube channel and Freedom Telegram channel. All the latest news is published there. Thank you so much for your trust, and see you next time.